Mic, mic check, mic check, 1, 2. Mic check, 1, 2, 1, 2. Good morning.
Council members, please come to order. Council members, please come to order. Good morning, everyone. We have Mr. Sam Rauch, NOAA Fisheries Deputy Assistant Director Administrator for Regulatory Programs, joining us this morning. And he plans to address the council and provide an opportunity for questions. After our discussion, we will resume with public testimony on C2, beginning with Kirill Basarjan, and circling back to Brooke Woods. Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am Sam Rauch. I'm the Deputy Director of NOAA's National Marine Fisheries Service out of Washington, D.C. I supervise the work of all of our regional offices, including the Alaska Regional Office, also the Office of Sustainable Fisheries, Habitat Conservation, and Protected Resources in DC. So I oversee most of the regulatory work across the country. And I'm very pleased to take the opportunity to address this council. I try to get to, or certainly before the pandemic, I used to try to get to the councils frequently, and I've not been able to do that. And I'm pleased that I'm able to start returning to talk with you about the good work that you've been doing. Nationally, fishing is incredibly important to the economy, to the people, to the fabric of the daily lives of many of our citizens. Provides over 2 million jobs nationally, both in the commercial and recreational sectors. About 300 billion in sales across the country, about 138 billion in value added, once again, between the commercial and recreational sectors. And the recreational sectors often, people ask why that is. And it's, you know, the hotels, the boats, the gear, all the kinds of things that are important for a recreational fishing trip, particularly on the ocean, can be a substantial contribution to local economies, both here and elsewhere in the country. We manage collectively, both through the National Marine Fisheries Service and with the assistance of the councils, about 500 stocks across the country, and they range from large scale major commercial fisheries like some of the ones in Alaska to really small scale subsistence territorial fisheries, artisanal fisheries like in many of our territories. And they're all important to somebody, and they have greater degrees on the economy, but they are part of the fabric of many communities. And we do collectively, and by we, I mean both the Fisheries Service and the councils, a really good job at that across the country. Of those stocks, only about 7 of them are subject to overfishing on average, 7% of them. So 93% are sustainable and are not subject to overfishing. That's a great statistics. And unlike some other countries, we can prove that through the very transparent science-based process that you all talk about every day in these council meetings. About only less than 20% are overfished, which means that they historically are gotten down to a lower population and are rebuilding. That is a pretty good number as well. We have more work to do on some of those numbers, but that is good. And that really speaks to the work that the councils do across the country, providing recommendations, sponsoring the very transparent science process that leads to good management recommendations, good management decisions on our part in terms of how we can continue to maintain that progress. A lot of the Magnus Act, for those of you who are historians, a lot of the sort of the statutory structure is built off the work that the North Pacific Council and Alaska did. The Alaska model is something that we in Washington, D.C., when we talk to other regions of the country, that's the model that we imposed years ago that we created years ago for the rest of the nation. And it has really been the model that has driven some of these national statistics. And so there's a lot of credit to be given to Alaska historically and Alaska today, or the North Pacific today. I shouldn't just say Alaska, the North Pacific today, in terms of how important not only the fisheries are here, but the way that is managed here in the North Pacific. more than half of the fish caught in the United States, the wild fish caught, are caught in the waters off Alaska. It is incredibly important to us. There are more workers associated with the fishing industry in Alaska than any other private industry in Alaska. There's 5.1 billion in sales out of these fisheries, 2.3 billion in added value, 74,000 full part-time positions, jobs in 2022. This is important work here. Yet we know that there are issues. There are current issues with all of our fisheries, and there are many issues here in Alaska. You were dealing with some of them here. I was able to hear some of the testimony yesterday afternoon, some of the really difficult issues that are being faced. We know that climate change is driving a lot of changes in our fisheries, changes of the level that we haven't seen before, that are creating new issues that we haven't seen before, that are requiring us to look at interactions between fisheries in a way that we haven't been able to before. These are all issues that we struggle with, that this council struggled with, other councils are struggling with it. You are not alone. We are seeing population shifts in many areas of the country, and that is causing a number of issues with our fisheries. We see stocks that are not doing nearly as well as they used to do at levels that are unprecedented, and that creates difficult challenges for all of us. And I know that we are working through that in good faith, but that still is a transformational change, both in terms of the drivers in the ocean and in terms of how we react to them. We, as in terms of the federal government, are looking at that, and we've invested, with Congress's help, an enormous amount of money in trying to, and resources in trying to get as ahead of this as we can, and to deal with the changes that we are already seeing. We took $350 million out of the Inflation Reduction Act that Congress passed and have allocated that to climate-ready fisheries across the country. A significant portion of that money is coming back into the Alaska fisheries. For instance, we put in $6.8 million to ADF&G last year for the Sustainable Salmon Fund, $2 million to the Arctic, to the Yukon-Kuskokwim Consortium for salmon restoration work, $1.4 million to the Kawalingan tribe of Unalaska to monitor their salmon returns. We are trying with the rest of the federal government and with the state and with all of you all to try to deal with the impacts of climate change on fisheries, to get fisheries and the communities that rely on fisheries in all the various forms that communities rely on fisheries, to be more resilient, to understand that these are changes that they're difficult to deal with. We ask a lot of the councils, and the councils, for those of you who are council members, I know how hard it is to prepare to come to these council meetings to deal with some very difficult issues. It is a lot of work, and we really appreciate it. We could not achieve what we do without the work that you all do. We recognize that in implementing the Climate Fisheries Initiative, there is a large part that we are investing in toward looking at new and different scientific approaches. How do we measure things? With climate change coming out there are new factors that are driving the health of these stocks in the ocean that we need to address. That's going to require a new investment in science, a new look at how we collect data, both ourselves and with our various partners in that. And that's exciting, but it is also change, right? One thing that you will learn if you're in this council process for very long is we value long, stable time series. And with all this new information, that means those time series are at least have to be calibrated at best. And it's questionable as to how we can continue to use them. And that creates a lot of scientific challenges. But once we resolve all that from the science perspective, then the work is going to come right straight back to here as to what to do with all that information. And you're already dealing with some of those issues right now. And from the federal government perspective, we understand that there is more work to be done with the council. We have allocated $20 million across the country to the councils to help them implement some of these climate change initiatives. We've given out base funding of about $375,000 to each council. And those grants are working their way through the process. We've also, the rest of that money is allocated in sort of a competition or where the councils are proposing the various different things to us about what they want to do to spend that. And we hope to make decisions on that soon. But we reflect, it's part that this is a partnership with us, and we can't just expect that all that scientific investment is just going to go and sit on the shelf. We want to do something about it. We want the council to do something about it. And we recognize that that is going to be make resource demands on the councils. And so we're trying to help them to do that. In addition, though, these changes are creating both issues with the industry in that, you know, the amount of fish available in the times and places that they were traditionally available are changing. And we are seeing stresses on our seafood industry. The amount of fish that are, the interactions are changing. We are seeing impacts on communities. We've got two initiatives briefly that I wanted to talk about that. First, in terms of the industry support, we put out a seafood strategy last year that we're still in the process of implementing, which is designed to support the U.S. industry, to increase access to U.S. fisheries, to raise the amount of to assist the U.S. industries in some of the international issues that are going on. For instance, our seafood inspection program is assisting USDA in trying to use Alaska products in the school food lunch program. Sustainable. We have a grant program that gave $500,000 to Alaska to promote and develop U.S. fisheries in Alaska. We're working with EDA and other programs. EDA did a $49 million grant to the Alaska Mariculture Initiative to help with aquaculture in Alaska for certain mariculture species. We're working with the trade representative on dealing with some of the very difficult international trade issues that are driving some of the market dynamics that are affecting the U.S. industries. Now, we're only the National Marine Fisheries Service, and there are a lot of these issues involve the work of other federal agencies or other partners. But we're trying to commit to renew the tools that we have and to be a convening force in some of these things to try to make it easier for the U.S. fisheries to grow. We think fishing is an important part of the nation. It's an important part of the health of the nation, and it's an important part to many communities. And to do that, we need to not just assume that the fisheries industry can do it on its own. We're going to try to do what we can to do that in a various different number of ways. But we also know that the fisheries work can have effects on many of those communities. Some of those are underserved, not all of them. Some of them are tribal communities that we will look at. And some historically, we may not have taken into account all the various effects that we have had. There is great economic benefit to come from stability and things like catch share programs and other things. There's also some allocations and sometimes impacts on local communities, impacts on subsistence fisheries or other kinds of things gets lost in those kinds of issues. Or we need to be mindful of those impacts going forward. We need to be mindful of when you support one fishing in one location, what that's doing. You know, those fish aren't caught elsewhere, what that does. And so we put out last year an equity and environmental justice strategy nationwide. It is a national strategy, so it lacks a lot of the details. But it talks about these issues and it talks about the renewed commitment of the Fisheries Service to looking at equity and environmental justice issues, looking at things like participatory rights. How can we working with the council, support more voices into the decision-making process? How can we look at the social effects of our actions and try to take those into account? How can we look at things like where we do habitat restoration or where we do our scientific surveys and try to make sure that we're not just following the gross domestic product or the largest economic value, but we look at things like subsistence fishing and the federal research and habitat work and their impacts on subsistence fishing and a wide variety of other things. We are trying to step down those national plans into regional plans, and I think the regional office either has or is going to talk with you about some of those things soon, and I encourage that. This is something across the board, though, that we are invested in trying to get at and trying to build that in there. That is well within our mandate under the Magnuson Act, and we want to be more mindful of those kinds of actions. And then the last thing that I wanted to mention, given that statement, was our work on the national standards. Those of you in the audience know that we are governed, the people up here are governed by 10 national standards, which cover a wide variety of topics. Every management measure that we do has to meet the best we can those 10 standards. Some of them haven't changed, so we issue guidance on those national standards. Those national standards are Congressly set, so we can't change the national standard, but we can look at issues that have arisen under them, and some of them haven't, our guidance on them haven't changed in decades. So we recently put out an advance notice of proposed rulemaking looking at changes to three of those national standards, National Standard 4, 8, and 9, which talk about allocation rights, which talk about communities and talk about bycatch. Issues that you were talking about yesterday. So we at the moment we put that out for comment and got a wide variety of comments about that, a huge response. Some people across the country saying the national standards, our guidance is just fine. There's no issue. You don't need to change anything. And others saying that this is exactly the issue we need to work on. And there are large scale changes that we need to do. And we're working through all of those. We hope to put out a proposed rule of any of those changes that we are actually proposing later this year, soon, in the spring or summer, and start the conversation. That will be a lengthy conversation. These are national guidelines, so they have to work not just for the North Pacific, but they have to work for the rest of the country as well. And so that we are being thoughtful and deliberative about that. But many of the issues that this council is struggling with are issues that are guided by those three provisions. So those are just a few of the things that we are dealing with nationally. I'm happy to talk with you all about that, but let me just end by once again commending this council in particular on the role model that you have been for the rest of the country historically and continue to be today, and the amount of work that I know it takes to be a council member. We truly appreciate it. This is a partnership and it only works because of the work that you all do here. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rauch, and for the recognition of the council. We really appreciate that. I'll see if any members have questions for you. Ms. Baker.
Through the chair. Thank you, and Mr. Rauch, for your presentation. I apologize if you said this, but I think as you mentioned, the potential revisions to the National Standard Guidelines is of particular importance in the North Pacific region. And I just wanted to confirm if you could for me that any potential revisions would go through the rulemaking process, like many of our council actions. So the next steps are for NOAA Fisheries to publish a proposed rule that would have a comment period, and then those comments would be considered before a final rule would be published. Is that the correct process?
That is our intention, is that recognizing these are truly national, any revisions that we would propose to do are national in scope, and that the councils are intimately involved in that. We would intend to publish anything that we intend to do as a proposed rule, try to figure out, depending on when that happens, what the optimal amount for both public and council input would be before we finalize any rule. And I anticipate that finalization process might take some time.
I have a follow-up comment if that's, I don't know if we're limited to questions, Madam Chair, but just thank you for that. And I think that's helpful for the public because many of them are familiar with that process. And I would just ask, I understand the timing is uncertain at this point, but if you are going into proposed rule publication, perhaps over the next few months that might be open during the summer months, please keep in mind the really critical fishing times for all Alaska fisheries, really, when it comes right down to it, and just take that into account for comment periods to really give the public an opportunity to meaningfully comment. Thank you.
Ms. Kimball.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments, Mr. Rauch. And my first question was similar to Ms. Baker's, and just to maybe add on to that, to hopefully keep in mind the ability for regional councils to comment as a body. We didn't have that opportunity really the first time that notice came out. We had very little time and we weren't able to notice the public to provide comments to us prior to us providing a letter. And if there's any opportunity to ensure that councils have an opportunity to come as a body and publicly discuss their comments, I think that is much preferred by our body and by the public. Similarly, we received a proposed rule from the agency, a report on that on confidentiality at the start of this meeting, some changes to confidentiality rules. I'm not going to ask you to delve into the details of that, but again, that comment period is closing rather quickly, and we did not receive really any details on how that would affect our region. And so just to help keep in mind our ability to comment substantively on any proposed rules the agency provides. We get a lot of value from our public having in the North Pacific, having the opportunity to comment to us publicly and then help shape our letters. So that was my first thing, was mainly just a comment. My second was I really appreciated your comments about Alaska, some of the real difficulties that the commercial industry is also facing in terms of market value and affecting not just the species that we manage here, but salmon fisheries across Alaska. And I appreciate your comments about the seafood strategy and NOAA being a convening force for other agencies. I think that has come out really as a highlight, that there are so many agencies that kind of touch or direct or regulate commercial fisheries that have so little information about seafood in comparison to your agency. And so as a convening force with USDA, with USTR, those sound like big, implausible things to move, but they are so important. I can't tell you how many calls or emails I've received from communities who are just facing, in Alaska, that are just facing really devastating impacts based on value. Most of those communities, the majority of their operating budgets for their governments come from seafood taxes. And when that value goes down, they have less to deal with in their community for all sorts of things. It's a real huge issue. I think we can come out of it at some point, but right now we're in a really, really bad spot. And so I hope the agency can either provide us more details on the implementation plan for the seafood strategy, or just take these comments to heart, that really providing that leadership role is very, very important to Alaska communities right now.
Thank you. Mr. Mesereau.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Rauch, for coming here and your words. Over the last few years, we've seen this pretty tremendous increase in tribal engagement. And I think maybe before you showed up, we had the Tanana chiefs come up and hadn't engaged with the council before, and they represent, I hesitate to say the number, but over 100 tribal nations in that one group. So by increasing our outreach, we've then increased participation, and we lack the capacity to really engage with them outside of this council in a way that they're asking for. And I think a lot of the interest and engagement as a result of making a more welcoming environment and trying to accommodate their needs. But in doing so, we've also created a huge additional workload for council staff and for the agency. And I think all of it's good, but I think everyone's being asked to do more outreach with less funding. And it would be helpful if in the future you kept that in mind, because I think this participation from the tribes is just beginning. We're going to see more of it, and we want to be able to accommodate their desire to be heard. And I think that you saw from yesterday, there's a lot of interest, and these fisheries issues aren't going away. And so anything you can do to try to help us, accommodate the increased interest and capacity to better communicate with the tribes, and maybe do more outreach into communities, which they're asking for, which is very time consuming for individual council members. If there's any way we can do anything to try to help the capacity, it would be great. And I know you have a lot of other things, and this isn't maybe the time for that, but the policies have dictated that there's more interest, and the issues, now we have the interest, and we want to be able to keep doing a better job of outreach.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. That is this public participation in the decision-making process. Having your voice heard and considered is a really important part of not only of our relationship with the tribes, but on our relationships with all the communities in Alaska. And it's very difficult to do in many places. We reflected that, and for the prior 3 years of the president's budget, we had asked for funds to do better outreach. Congress did not support that, so it did not make it into this year's budget. So now, having not gotten the congressional increase that we asked for to do the very thing you just asked, we are trying to find that with other funds as assigned. And so we are trying to make that investment. It is more challenging to do that, but we are still committed to trying to work to improve this process. And so I think some of our grander plans had to be put on hold, but it is still something that both we and the council need to work through. It's not something that is going to be improved immediately overnight, but it is something that we constantly try to do. And so I fully support your ideas, and we've tried, We will continue to try to find a way to both on our own part and working with the councils to support broader outreach.
Ms. Vanderhoven.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Ruck. Along the same lines of needing to do more with less, I'm always watching our surveys. There's such a critical foundation to our process, and seeing distributional changes and other impacts of climate change. I appreciate the additional funding and the new techniques that are coming online and have been being developed. We've seen a lot of the forefront here in the North Pacific and with the Science Center. But we continue to see our surveys eroding and having to cancel surveys due to lack of funding. And it wasn't due to funding or climate change, but we lost our 2020 Bering Sea survey due to COVID. And we saw the devastating outcome from just missing 1 year of data there. And so maybe it's the same answer as to Mr. Mesereau. We keep asking and we keep trying, but that's an area that I think we would all continue to ask to continue to try to find the resources to make those surveys happen, at least until some of these other tools are ready for prime time and can be implemented, and maybe help alleviate some of that cost issue.
Thank you for that comment. We completely understand the value of our survey work, our data collection work, and it's not just surveys, although surveys are the big ticket item for that. If we don't collect that data, then neither you nor we can do the things we need to do, right? I stressed how we've made all those advances because we're a science-based organization. Well, that's where the science comes from. So I completely agree with you that collecting that science in a credible, consistent manner is really important for all the work that we do. And we've been challenged. Everything being equal, with inflation, every year you can do a little bit less. And so, and many of our survey ships are also getting older. And so it's difficult to, they have unexpected maintenance issues, just like a car would. We struggle to keep up with it. There's been some fundings that we've tried, with unlike the participation funds, we did get some funds that have supported our service that have allowed us to continue to do this, but this will continue to be a challenge going forward as it continues to be more expensive every year. Looking at that and still doing additional work, because there's always people want to do something new and different elsewhere. But this is something that I spend an awful lot of my time with the chief scientist, with the operational deputy, and with my boss, Janet Coit, the AA, trying to make sure we can maintain that survey enterprise and grow it appropriately. It is challenging, as you know, and we are not always successful. It is something that we're always trying to do.
Ms. Kimball.
Thank you. And a follow up to that, Mr. Rauken, I don't understand the NOAA budget process fully, but why can't we use some of the hundreds of millions of dollars of the climate readiness funding to fund surveys into the future? Where's the bright line where that's not possible? Because we've been told consistently that not just like more data, but being able to do our survey modernization project and things that the Alaska Fisheries Science Center has already gotten underway are some of these kind of key actions to get us more climate ready, which for Alaska, for the North Pacific, is supposed to mean more resilient to change. So where's the line where that's not possible, so that we can be sure we have survey funding for the next at least several years based on those IRA funds?
Well, as you noted at the tail end of your comment, those funds are time limited, right? They expire in 2.5 years now. So under no circumstances can we sort of fund things into the future with those funds, because those funds do go away. A lot of the $300 million that we're talking about for climate ready fisheries is going into improving science. We're trying to make investments today that can be shifted over and improve the science enterprise after that 2.5 years. So a lot of that is going to be done. We do have to be mindful of what Congress asked us to do. Excuse me. So there are limits based on the congressional language. We have to be we have to comply with the congressional limits. So there are certain things that we can do to improve our survey work and to bolster our existing surveys. But Congress has asked us to do transformational new things. And so we are mindful that Congress gives the money to do something new, not just to bolster our status quo. That's a different funding line. And so it's a delicate balance. I'm happy to talk with you in some more depth about where that line is based on this particular project. But we can't just take the money that Congress gave us to do new initiatives and fund status quo work. But that doesn't mean that we can't make the status quo work in the future better, more efficient, more cost effective, which is what we're trying to do.
Yes, Mr. Twite.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Mr. Rock, thank you very much for your introductory remarks. They, I think, summarized very well both the value of the approach that this council has taken since the beginning of the Magnuson-Stevens Act, the value both to sustainable fisheries as well as to the nation. But they also equally well describe a lot of the challenges that are coming at us that, quite frankly, we're not at all sure that our past accomplishments leave us in a good position to actually tackle. And you described some of the upcoming challenges really well, as did some of the questions from my fellow council members. They're challenges that we could not have even imagined just a few years ago. And so to expect that our current suite of tools would be the right set for us to tackle these new challenges would be foolhardy for us as a council. We recognize that. We're undertaking a programmatic environmental impact statement, which really fundamentally is bureaucratic speak for trying to take a really hard, objective look at ourselves in the mirror, as well as pay attention to how others see us when they look at us, and use that as the basis then for deciding which tools are still robust and valuable, which tools with some improvement could help, and where we need to develop new tools. I think we're very hopeful that through efforts like the agency's Climate Ecosystem Fisheries Initiative, some of those new tools will be available for us to consider in time for this effort. So we're pretty excited about it. A lot of good things are coming together. The IRA funding can really help us out with that on the climate change end of it, both at the council level and at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center. So it's an important time to be doing this. It's a good time to be doing this. And I guess I'm going to take a risk here and ask you a question of what advice you would have for us as we undertake that programmatic process, and what you would suggest we focus on.
Yeah, thank you for the question. We've seen this in a number of councils, and I know that I highlighted the importance and sort of the leadership of the North Pacific Council, but there are a number of councils, particularly on the East Coast, that are already dealing with these kinds of issues as the stocks move between council jurisdictions. And so they've had to work closely amongst themselves to deal with this very issue. And so you look at both where you are now and where you might be. And the one thing that's difficult about that is nobody knows for sure what we might be. So you have to plan for different scenarios. And to some extent, that's the easier part of the analysis, to get the science, to get to better, but you still are not going to know. And so what is difficult for us as managers is to figure out, well, what then do we do? Because the scientists can do a really good job saying, here's the information that will tell you when you're in a new and different climate regime. We have to figure out when we're there and when to pull the trigger and what that means when we pull the trigger. I have found that it is very difficult for, I'm sure you all will be better. It has been very difficult for other councils to transition from, let's understand the new drivers going into the future, to let's have a firm plan for what to do about it. That's difficult for councils to get ahead of. At what point do the councils recommend a change in action? And what does that change in action look like? I don't have advice on that, but that has been the most difficult thing going going from looking at what is driving change to actually how then that changes what we do. And I would encourage you to spend some time thinking about that part of the equation.
Yes, Mr. Twite.
Thanks, Mr. Rauch. One of the, I think one of the key sort of points in that transition that you're talking about is kind of the linking of indicators to decision points and trying to do that proactively instead of reactively. And at what point do we, for instance, say that there's been enough change in the ecosystem for long enough that we need to switch from one management parameter to another? And those are huge decisions that could be very destabilizing. And so they will be incredibly difficult and probably controversial subjects. And I'm hopeful that the climate and ecosystem fisheries initiative may well help, at least on the science end, with suggesting suites of indicators that councils could at least be considering, as well as constructing tools for us that allow us to, in advance, try out some different management frameworks and dry lab them in essence, and at least understand what some of their consequences might be, so that we can go into that at least somewhat informed. So I think the initiative is designed to help us with that some, and I think we've got the right people, certainly in the Alaska Fisheries Science Center, to help with that. But I'm very hopeful that the agency will. I appreciate your recognition, and I'm hopeful the agency can find a way to really support that. I'm nervous that we only have 2.5 years now. That makes me extremely nervous.
Any further questions, comments from council members? Mr. Rauch, we really appreciate you joining us this morning and your comments. Thank you. So we will do just a quick 5-minute stand down, and we will resume with public testimony on C2, starting with Kirill Basarjan. Council members, please come back to order. We will resume public testimony on agenda item C2. We have a little over 20 testifiers left. We're circling back to Kirill Basarjan first. He's joining us remotely, followed by Johnny Evan.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Kirill Basarjan. I represent K-Bay Fisheries Association. And also right now, since we're in this topic, I'm voicing for the communities here in Alaska for the C2 salmon bycatch testimony for April 2024. Members of council, I speak today as a representative of the frustrated communities across Alaska who are suffering due to the government's mismanagement of the bycatch. Families are struggling to feed themselves and afford basic necessities like gas for snow machines to collect firewood for winter warmth. In some cases, sled dogs essential for transportation and livelihoods are weak and malnutrition due to the lack of food. This is because subsistence fisheries are being shut down, prioritizing trawl fleets over local communities. The trawl fleet claims that rural communities will suffer financially if they don't operate, but the truth is they are not supporting communities. Canneries are shutting down, and fishermen are not being paid. The small fishing industry, on the other hand, can provide better revenue and support local communities. Trawlers claim to supply the food chain and support communities, but for how long? Their unsustainable practices are destroying the very foundation of the ocean's biodiversity. They are clear-cutting our ocean's resource, leaving nothing for future generations. The food chain will collapse and communities will be left with nothing. Trawlers are deceiving the public and local communities with false promises of employment and sustainability. Just like oil companies, they arrive with promises of jobs and economic growth, but only deliver short-term benefits before abandoning the communities, leaving behind destruction of forest, land, and water contamination. Similarly, trawlers promise to employ local people, but for how long? As long as they can exploit the resources, destroying vegetation, catching all the chum and other salmon species, leaving almost none left to reproduce. They claim they don't catch any more chum, but that's because they're nearly wiped out the original spawning fish and species. We must hold trawlers accountable for their harm practices and demand sustainable, responsible fishing methods that prioritize the long-term health of our ecosystem and communities. Just as chemical companies are sued for destroying people's land and water, trawlers should be held liable for the loss of resources and livelihoods they cause. Local communities deserve justice and compensation for the harm inflicted upon them. We must take action to protect our resources and ensure a sustainable future for our communities. Trawlers are perpetrating a destructive legacy in our oceans, mirroring the harmful practices of chemical companies that ravage our land and water resources. By clear-cutting our ocean's biodiversity, trawlers are causing irreparable harm to the delicate balance of marine ecosystems. Just as we hold chemical companies accountable for environmental devastation, we must equally hold trawlers responsible for ecological destruction they inflict. The depletion of chum and other salmon species, the destruction of vegetation, and the degradation of ocean health are all direct consequences of trawlers' actions. We must take decisive action to protect our ocean's biodiversity and ensure sustainable fishing practices that prioritize the long-term health of our ecosystem and communities. If the trawl fleet continues, it will destroy pollock and other fish species, including spawning grounds. We risk losing not only Chinook and chum, but every other fish species. The only option is to close the trawl fleet and allow smaller, sustainable fishing industries to support our communities. We demand a change in priorities and shift towards sustainable fishing practices that put local communities first. It's time to hold trawlers accountable for their role in ocean destruction and demand responsible fishing practices that safeguard the future of our oceans and communities that depend on them. I stand before you today as a voice for the voiceless, the countless families, fishermen, and communities ravaged by the destruction practices of trawlers for far too long. These industries have exploited our oceans, leaving this devastation in their wake. It's nothing short of oceanic genocide. Our Constitution declares that the people, not the government, make the laws. Yet trawlers have allowed to pillage and plunder our marine resources with impunity. Greed has triumphed over people's basic right to feed their families. The injustice is gut-wrenching. Families go hungry, small-scale fishermen are pushed back to the brink of extinction, and the ocean's biodiversity is